Nanking, 1937. I may as well do an intro to the book. Tim Newark, Turning the Tide of War, 50 Battles That Changed the Course of Modern History. Nanking, 1937. With its capture of the then Chinese capital at Nanking, Japan had soundly defeated its Chinese nationalist opponents and made itself master of crucial parts of the Chinese mainland. However, the barbaric behavior of Japanese troops shocked the world. Dreadful tales of massacres and rape heralded an age of grotesque atrocities against prisoners and civilians caught up in war. The Second World War began in Asia, not with Pearl Harbor, but with the Japanese invasion of China in 1937, which was the culminating phase of Japan's campaigns of aggrandizement. These campaigns had begun with the Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 95 and continued through the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, and the First World War, in which Japan seized German colonies. Civil war had racked China during the 1920s, and Japan had exploited its weakness by invading Manchuria in 1931. A plot was fabricated called the Mukden Incident, in which it was claimed that China wanted to blow up the railway between Mukden and Port Arthur. The Japanese seized the province and called it Manchukuo. Puyi, the last emperor of China, was then set up there as the puppet ruler. China responded with an effective boycott of trade to Japan, and in retaliation, a Japanese army landed at Shanghai. A fierce battle followed, with China eventually agreeing to end its boycott. Tensions between the two nations grew markedly. Japanese society was becoming increasingly militarized, and in 1936 a group of army officers tried to take over the government and press on with the conquest of China. The coup was crushed, but the rebels did not have long to wait for their wishes to be fulfilled. The invasion of China. On the 7th of July 1937, Japan fabricated another clash in northern China at the Marco Polo Bridge near Tianjin as an excuse to launch a full-scale invasion of China. In the titanic struggle that would follow, the odds favored Japan. Japan was the most modern power in Asia with a highly effective navy and air force. The army was 300,000 strong and equipped with the latest weapons. The massive Chinese alliance ranged against Japan was poorly equipped and trained, and possessed neither naval nor air forces. The main Chinese army was the nationalist force led by General Chiang Kai-shek, which numbered 2 million men and was based around the capital at Nanking. In northwest China, there was a guerrilla army of 150,000 troops belonging to the communists. The two Chinese factions agreed to unite against Japan, but it was an uneasy alliance. In summer 1937, Japanese armies captured Peking and Tianjin, then marched west and south, overcoming all Chinese opposition. By the autumn, however, resistance from the Chinese population as well as its military forces had begun to slow down the Japanese, and their supply lines had become stretched. A second assault on Shanghai was met with strong resistance, and it took several months of Japanese amphibious landings and aerial attacks to clear the city. In September, a Japanese division was defeated by a communist division in northwest China, greatly raising the morale of the Chinese and consolidating communist power in that part of the country. The Japanese had thought the conquest of China would be easy, but they had been given a much harder time than they expected. This frustration and anger was carried westwards by the conquerors of Shanghai as they marched towards the nationalist capital of Nanking. In November 1937, 3 Japanese armies raced towards Nanking. Their mood was ruthless, and they annihilated the villages and towns in their way. For example, Suzhou was a historic city on the east bank of Taihu Lake, famous for its ancient canals and bridges, which had earned it the name of the Venice of China. On entering the city, the Japanese massacred its inhabitants, burned down its historic landmarks, and took away thousands of women to act as sex slaves for Japanese soldiers. In days, the population was reduced from 350,000 to less than 500. Sadly, this was just the beginning. On the 7th of December, the Japanese armies closed in on Nanking itself. The defending Chinese army of 300,000 was trapped by the river Yangtze behind the city and could offer little decisive resistance. Chiang Kai-shek ordered a chaotic last-minute retreat from the city. For those soldiers remaining, thoughts turned to surrender. General Matsui Iwane was in overall command of the Japanese forces in his region, and he saw the conquest of the capital as his crowning glory. He regarded it as an international showcase for the Japanese army, and he gave strict orders that entry into the city should be conducted in a disciplined manner that would impress the Chinese and the rest of the world. Plunder and bad behavior were not to be tolerated, and guards were to be posted to protect the citizens. Such grand plans were sunk by his own illness and a change in command. Emperor Hirohito placed his uncle, Prince Asaka Yasuhiko, in command of the Japanese forces at Nanking. As a member of the royal family, his authority was superior to that of any other commander in the field. Asaka was influenced by the ruthless General Nakajima, and a counter-command was issued to the troops which instructed them to execute all prisoners of war. Before dawn on the 13th of December, a mere 50,000 Japanese troops broke through the walls of Nanking and found themselves in charge of 90,000 Chinese soldiers and 500,000 civilians. Why, especially with superior numbers, did the Chinese not demonstrate the same resistance they had shown at Shanghai? It appears that the Chinese army in Nanking may well have been exhausted by its retreat from Shanghai, and the offers of fair treatment seemed much more attractive than earlier on in the campaign. Many of the soldiers threw away their weapons and offered themselves up for arrest. There appears to have been little coordinated action from the Chinese commanders in the city. A catastrophic plunge in morale had given the Japanese their greatest victory in the campaign. Tragically, the offers of fair treatment were false, and the Chinese soldiers were bound and led off for execution. Such an easy, unexpected victory meant that any lingering respect the Japanese military might have felt for their Chinese captives disappeared completely. It was the beginning of a holocaust. The rape of Nanking. Having feared the Chinese earlier in the campaign, the Japanese soldiers now despised them for their cowardice. Heavily outnumbered, the Japanese subdued the Chinese by breaking them into small groups, binding their arms, and then leading them off to the killing grounds. Huddled together, the Chinese were then machine-gunned to death. So many soldiers were murdered that there were not enough pits to bury them in, and some were half-burned or thrown into the river Yangtze. With the execution of the Chinese soldiers, the Japanese army poured into Nanking and inflicted a crazed orgy of savagery on its civilians. Men, women, and children were shot at random. When the bullets ran out, swords and bayonets were used. Piles of corpses built up on every street. The execution of civilians became a sport, and soldiers competed to see who would kill the most in the shortest time. When the killing became boring, hideous tortures were invented. Many Japanese took photographs of one another, holding severed heads and grinning, enjoying the torture and the slaughter. Females of any age were subjected to brutal sexual assaults by gangs of Japanese soldiers, who then mutilated and killed them. The actions were sickening and barbaric, but they continued for days, with officers encouraging their soldiers. The horror subsided on the 17th of December when General Matsui rose from his sickbed and entered the city. He was shocked by what he heard of the behavior of his troops, but it was too late for the 250,000 Chinese men, women, and children who had been massacred, or the 80,000 women who had been raped. Despite Matsui's disapproval, the atrocities went on for weeks afterwards. The rape of Nanking is one of the great war atrocities of the 20th century. The Japanese government tried to bury the incident, and to a certain extent it has succeeded because the horror of it has not implanted itself in Western sensibilities to the extent of German and Russian atrocities. The lack of punishment of the soldiers involved meant that such a barbarity was considered to be acceptable behavior among the Japanese army for the rest of the Second World War, its conquering soldiers treating civilians and prisoners of war in the most appalling ways. For the Chinese, the lesson was clear. They could expect no mercy. The war of resistance was to continue for many more years. So I'm not quite sure how they turned the tide of battle. Well, I guess, the Chinese resistance broke, and that's what turned the tide. They outnumbered the Japanese, um, but they lacked the will to fight, and there was no proper leadership, it sounds like. Chaos, a chaotic retreat that never really got any better. Yeah, mutilations and stuff. Mutilating and killing people. Ooh. Hundreds of thousands. So, there you have it. That didn't really use too much American propaganda in there. I think it just kind of told the story. Giving a shout out to the communists in the North with their victory. Um, an uneasy alliance between the communists and the nationalists to fight the Japanese. Yeah. So there you go. There's that one. I'll be back with another one soon. I know you can barely wait. Can't stand it. You're just so excited.